Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. I've got Cindy Cohn here, and she is the Executive Director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, where should we begin? Let's go into, can you explain more to my audience what the EFF is and what they do?
Yeah, EFF is the largest and oldest digital rights organization in the world. We were founded in 1990, so we predate the World Wide Web. And our job is basically to make sure that when you go online, your rights go with you. So we get very involved in issues around free speech, around privacy, around innovation, around all of the pieces that help make the digital world work for you. Because the founders of EFF realized that we were building this extremely powerful network that could be marshaled against people, or it could be an agent of their empowerment. And they created EFF full of lawyers and technologists and activists to try to make sure that the internet, as much as we can, stays on your side, user side.
So I've been doing an interview series with my dad called Stewart Squared. His name is Stewart Alsop as well, and we've talked a lot about the rise of the PC industry as the AI thing has started to increase. And so I'm very familiar with the early part of the PC industry, and my interest in that show has been trying to grill my dad about what was happening in the 1960s that led into the 1970s, which led into the 1980s to understand what the countercultural revolution was like, what flow did it have. And then in my research for this, I realized that Mitch Kapoor is involved with the EFF. Is that right?
Yeah, Mitch Kapor is one of the founders of EFF. There were three founders: Mitch, John Perry Barlow, and John Gilmore. Steve Wozniak also gave some early support as well. So they were kind of, but the first three were really the visionaries, and then Steve joined pretty quickly thereafter.
Very cool. And so, what, like, in your eyes, doesn't have to be about EFF, but like in Silicon Valley, what was that relationship between the counterculture that kind of led into Silicon Valley, and why? And if we want to go into the EFF part, like, what were the countercultural sort of threads leading into that?
Yeah, I mean, John Markoff, who is a former New York Times journalist, has written a whole book on this and traced them. But I think that there is a way in which a lot of the people who were involved in the counterculture in the 60s and the 70s really gravitated to computers, to a digital world. And, fundamentally, John Perry Barlow was of that piece as well. And, as the internet got developed, they really saw the opportunity to try to build a new society that could be in many ways better than the society that became before it. And Barlow famously said in the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, we're building a place where, the quality of your ideas is what you're evaluated with, without fear or favor, based upon where you were born or the color of your skin or other things. So, there was an idea that being freed of our physical bodies in the way that the network makes it, made
Hmm.
them people's ideas and thoughts and ways of expressing themselves would be how they were evaluated, as opposed to, say, whether your dad was rich, or whether you were born the right color, or whether you had, other kinds of things. And, I don't think anybody thought that that would magically happen. I think that that's one of the mistakes that people make about the counterculture and also about Barlow. I don't think that you don't simultaneously found a fighty organization full of lawyers to bring lawsuits and think it's going to magically happen. But he did think there was a possibility to solve some of the problems that he saw in the non-digital world through the digital world. And of course, the fundamental one was so that people could organize across distance, right? When
Hmm.
this is hard for people today to remember, but it used to be very, very expensive to try to stay in good communication with people who live far away.
Hmm.
And the fundamental thing that the internet did was make it basically free for most purposes for people to communicate and keep relationships up across distance. And so one of the opportunities there is that you could really build movement. You could build social movements and share ideas and what they used to say, you had to, a printing press, you had to own the press in order to speak to a lot of people. And this really took that bar down. And I think that one of the things that people in the counterculture in general, not, this very overgeneralization, but that these falling down of some of the physical walls and boundaries made an opportunity for something better to happen. Now, I would say, looking back now in 2026, like, we got some of those benefits, but we're still way long way, and lots of things came up and really got in the way of that vision happening. But I think that's what people saw as a possibility, and I think that infused especially some of the early excitement around kind of the internet as a digital tool.
Mm. So interesting because in the 1960s, 1970s, the sci-fi was very optimistic, and then it's starting probably about in the 80s and the 90s. The sci-fi got a lot more cyberpunk.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if you've heard of the term solar punk before, but I'm very excited about this sort of solar punk. I do think that original vision of the hackers in the 70s and the 80s kind of can come to fruition, but I think it's going to look a lot different than what they were talking about, because I think the nation state itself is going to go through a lot of challenges. Um, so,
I mean, look,
okay,
we
I like.
didn't have
Yep,
climate
yep.
change to worry about. People were not factoring in energy, right, as a
Mm,
piece of this, in the way that I don't think you can stand in
mm,
2026 and think that you don't have to think about the electricity part of a digital world, and be serious about the all the pieces that go into making these, because of climate change and because of the, where our world sits now. It's not like people didn't care about the environment before, but the science and the issues around it were not nearly in the place that they are now. So I think lots of things are going to change. I mean, I will tell you that at least Barlow thought the nation state wasn't going to survive the internet. Now,
Okay,
I
that's an
didn't agree
interesting
with him.
point. Okay,
I didn't
okay.
agree with him, but lots of I wouldn't say that idea is 2026. I think the idea that we would get beyond the nation state into some other model of a world. And again, Barlow was a pretty big libertarian. I think he thought that the world
Mm,
would be better if there weren't governments, that people would be kinder to each other if there weren't governments. I'm not sure I agree with him on a couple of levels, but that part isn't new.
mm, interesting. So yeah, the energy piece is interesting because the solar panels and the batteries do seem like they're getting pretty good, and that we're starting to see the sort of exponential increase in both capacity and in terms of actually getting the solar panels. Solar itself has a lot of crazy issues, including the lithium and the sort of like non-aesthetic large solar farms and types of those things. But I'm actually pretty excited about it, particularly related to the nuclear energy and the solar power kind of in conjunction, creating a different energy environment that we've been in. The political thing is really interesting. Let's talk about um, so it was so interesting growing up in Silicon Valley and kind of having the sort of in-group Silicon Valley. This is technology is going to lead to good, only good. Like let's keep on going. And then somewhere around the 2010s, I read a book by a Russian author, I think, but he's in America. He lives in America, and this author, I can't remember his name right, but that was the first book where I was like, oh, maybe this idea I have of this technology only leads to the good. It has some holes in it, and then of course in 2020 it all started to kind of shift. I mean, it seems like you've been in this for a lot longer. So did you? What were your thoughts? When did it start to shift in your view?
I don't think it ever shifted for me. Um,
Mm,
I don't think that I ever thought that the world was going to be better magically, and that it would only be better. I never thought that. The first thing we had to do was sue the government to free up encryption from the
what
national
year was that?
security. Yeah, the Bernstein case, which was the first case that I handled for EFF, was about freeing up the tools of privacy from governmental control. No, I never thought that. I thought there was a chance just that we could use some of the technical benefits to make to solve to address some of the problems in the
Mm,
non-digital world. But again, I've always been a litigator. I'm a fighter, right? Like these are not things that I ever thought were going to be handed to it or magical or that things shifted. I mean, a couple of things shifted. One of the things that shifted was that I did not anticipate that surveilling everybody was going to become the predominant business model of the internet. I thought that there would be other options, that the five big tech companies would not be the only companies that provided the
Mm,
entire internet to us, essentially, right? That there wouldn't be competition, and that essentially all of them pretty much would adopt a business
mm,
model of 360 surveillance, and then sell that back to the government as a thing. Like, I would say that the predominance of that probably it has been pretty great, and some of the factors that led to that aren't technical, right? They're about us deciding we didn't care about competition law anymore, and we were just going to let the companies
mm.
all gobble each other up and become one big company, which was a problem that predated the internet with the AT&T and all the way back to the
Microsoft.
railroads.
Yep.
um, but I didn't quite think about that in the way that it actually turned out. I thought that so I did not, that was a surprise to me, but that's different than thinking that the internet was going to be magically perfect.
Mm. But that's not a common thread in Silicon Valley, right? You were surrounded by a lot of people who like were pretty optimistic about it in Silicon Valley, and kind of like, is that right, or is that only
I
me
didn't
basically
run in
from
those
your?
circles, honestly. I
Oh,
didn't run
interesting.
in those circles. Silicon Valley is, I really cared about. I really come more out of the hacker community, not
Mm,
the tech bro community,
mm,
the money.
mm, mm,
um,
mm,
and certainly people thought there were possibilities. I thought there were possibilities, but I think this story that there was a bunch of wide-eyed idiots who thought that the world was going to be magically better with technology, I think is a story that is being I mean, I'm sure they existed. I'm not saying they didn't, but it's not the world that's not the part of tech that I was in at the time. And I think that, there was probably, a lot of people who thought maybe that the government was a malicious force, that we should reduce the power of
mm.
government in the digital world, who were part of that. But I don't think that, so those might have been the differences, but and I was never part of that, but I definitely saw a lot of people who thought that the government was the main thing that we had to deal with, and we're not as focused on the
Mm,
corporate power. Um,
mm,
but that's not the same thing. I think that's a slightly different thing than the uh, the idea that Silicon Valley was full of people who didn't understand the risks that could come
mm.
with the digital world. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm splitting hairs, but I don't. I was never part of.
No,
I
I
was
get it. There was
part of
in
the
the
money.
80s.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 80s, the 90s, there was this like, from the countercultural, a lot of people who were not aligned with the corporate sort of thing that was going on, but then that corporate thing kind of created something new in Silicon Valley. I mean, Apple was a corporation, but Apple was kind of filled with a lot of these hackers and stuff like that, and then they sort of like, and then, but in my mind, it really comes around in Web 2.0 in 2006, once LifeLog went away in I believe it was DARPA. And then on the same day, Facebook was founded, or in a similar time frame, Facebook was founded, and then all of a sudden, basically does the same thing. I think they're like, it created this sort of this, as you said it, the corporation. I don't know if you said this exactly, but the corporation essentially swallowed the Silicon Valley hacker ethos and created a large centralization pipeline that basically brought all of the data into corporations. I really
Yep.
like what you said about the railroads, because the railroads, I've been on that train to try to figure out what happened. When did it happen? And and like, yeah, in Santa Clara, it happened in Silicon Valley, of course, but having nothing to do with Silicon Valley, because the railroads were, and they turned the 19th Amendment into a way for corporations to get the same free speech clauses as people. Is that accurate about what happened in
No,
late 1800s? No.
I,
Mm.
well, I don't know that history, but I don't think the
Mm.
19th Amendment has much to do with whether corporations are protected under the First Amendment. That's a pure First Amendment question.
Mm.
Um, so I don't know
Okay,
that
I'll go.
story,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I'll go look it up again.
but I think that I think that um, there's a lot of strands in there, but I do think that the the people, the kind of second generation people, like we were talking about 2005, 2006, really came out and um, you know, took Silicon Valley in a quite different direction. Now,
Mm.
let's be clear. There was always a strain of Silicon Valley that was about building military tools, right?
Yep.
Like we're talking about consumer facing tech companies, which has always been a piece of Silicon Valley, but it's not the whole thing. Right, General Dynamics, SRI, like I think that again, I think there's people looking for kind of less complicated narratives about Silicon
Mm.
Valley. Um, um, it is definitely the case that we're seeing all of the big consumer facing tech companies, and including ones who aren't consumer facing, like Palantir, really embrace their role as
Yes.
building military tools in a level where they were embarrassed about it or hid it or weren't that straight about it. So that's a change, but it's always been the case that there's a substrate of Silicon Valley that was a military defense
Yep.
contractor.
Yep.
Um, and that the hacker piece, it wasn't over
Oh,
there
interesting.
very much, but and look, there was the TV show Silicon Valley, which was basically making fun of how the ethos that was spread around the whole valley about we can make the world a better place, blah blah
Mhm,
blah,
mhm,
was
mhm,
co-opted by people who
mhm.
just wanted money,
Yep.
and built this 360 surveillance model and tried to convince everybody that that was what they wanted all along. um,
Mm.
it made for good satire, and it certainly occurred, but I don't know that that's the whole story of the valley or ever was.
Mm.
But this so
Is the hacker culture still alive in Silicon Valley?
I don't know about Silicon. Hacker culture is still very alive. Look, the
Mm.
open source community is big. I just went to a big conference called Scale in LA. There were thousands of people there who are, it's the Linux users group. The Hope Conference in New York. We go to DEF CON. Like, there is a huge community of people who are open source, who are trying to build tools that can survive, the that that can survive even if the tech giants aren't our friends. So trying to build places where you don't have to use Amazon as your compute or Google as your compute, but instead have something that's built only on open source that can't be co-opted. They're small, but they've always been small compared to the money, right? It's a lot easier to build something if you've got money.
Yeah.
The open
Well,
source community has always been more DIY, and it's under attack right now, right?
ooh, can you talk more about that? Yeah.
There's a bunch of these age verification bills,
Yeah.
including one that passed in California, another one that passed in Colorado, that is going to make open source,
Whoa.
on its face, impossible, because you can't offer a tool that is fully open source and one that mandates hooks
Mm.
to age verification. So the community's under attack right now from people, legislators, who don't know the difference between the people they're mad at and the other babies in the bathwater in the way that they are legislating. Or maybe they do want to get rid of open source, but it's under attack right now. It's an important attack, and it's important that the community not be ignored in favor of, these big guys suck all the attention out of the room. And a lot of what EFF has always tried to do is speak up for
Mm.
people who are not claiming all of the attention, and who I think are a key to getting us out of this situation. We need to have the means of computation under our control again if we're going to get out of this. And I think it's especially important in the age of AI.
Let's talk about that because you guys did. I can't remember the term, but the when the Department of Defense went after Anthropic, you guys have supported them and supported Anthropic, and I like it's been such an interesting time to try to consider what are the political like what do I believe in all these different situations over the past 6 years. But so Anthropic is a closed source company, but they are definitely seem more aligned with people. There's more trust. I have more trust. I know that the other people, and I think I am part of that open source group that you just talked about. I'm definitely going to get very into building a lot of open source, but I don't trust OpenAI. I think that they're definitely like they feel very wrapped up in a lot of the stuff we've been discussing, whereas Anthropic feels, at least they made a statement about like, okay, we're not going to surveil Americans with this technology. We're not going to allow the government to surveil the technology. We don't need to talk about Anthropic specifically. I've already done a lot of research. I would love to talk about how do we get to open source AI. And I think for my listeners, it's really important to understand that there's open source software, and then there are open weights for LLMs specifically. The open source question for LLMs is not the same question as it is for software. It takes like millions and millions of dollars to build these foundational models, and all the ones that did that investment, they're all closed weights. So we can't tell how the weights are generating the responses. And having those open weights is so important. And the only people doing it are in China. And that's a whole other thing.
I think Mistral's open weight. I think the French one is open weight too.
Yeah. And Meta built, which is another side story we can talk about what open source meant in the 2010s. But so Mistral also doing open weights, and so it's just so crazy the cost of building these foundational models. Like, what's your vision for how do we actually create that? Were they talking about this at the conference of like how do we build open weight, free for all? Like everybody understands what level of censorship and all these different things are going into the layer.
I mean, I wasn't in any of the sessions about that, so I don't know. I think that there's a couple of ways that we could get to this. One is that, we could, the internet was built by, you know, the government
Mm,
and using various incentives to try to support research institutions
yeah,
and other
interesting.
people building it. I'm a little nervous about, especially with our current government control of something like that. But a government could do that. I believe the Swiss government has just built
Hmm.
a version of their own things. I don't know if they used one of the foundation models and just put something on top of it, or whether they built it from scratch. I mean, the other way to do it is, kind of the way that we've done, like the railroads or other things, is the government requires them to license it on fair and equitable terms, so
Hmm.
that they are not in charge substantively, even if they might still get a recovery. And AI lends itself to that already, right? People can go and they can download, the tool and mess with it and do whatever they want. So AI could lend itself to something like that if the government said, look, you get to recoup a certain amount of money, and then you have to make
Interesting.
it available. I mean, that's the way we do a lot of things in copyright, right? In copyright, it's not a copyright problem. Excuse me. I'm not saying this is a copyright problem, but what I'm saying is that there are other tools. If you look
Hmm.
across the law, like somebody writes a song, they own the copyright in the song, but you can make a cover version of that song as long as you pay them a certain
Yeah,
amount
interesting.
per song per copy, right? That's why people can do covers. We don't let In lots of areas, we don't let ownership equal 100% control. And we could do versions of that to make these foundation models more available to the rest of people, so that then people can do whatever they want and offer people various options for business models and other things on top of it. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to support, you know, new creation of new models from scratch. I mean, I
Hmm.
think the open weight models are already winning in some ways against the closed weight ones. It depends on the issue that you're talking about, and there's still a big race going on. But so I think it's not like we're stuck in so even if you
Yeah,
own a piece of
interesting.
real property, you can require people to be able to have to walk across it, right? Those are called easements. Like, it's not it's not unheard of to think about ways that just because somebody created something, society has to recreate it from scratch in order for other people to be able to use it. There's plenty of precedent for that in the
Mm,
world. What's the right one here? I don't know yet. I think
mm,
that we're still seeing, but I think this idea that that's out of scope is like historically just inaccurate and
mm,
look at it. And so what, I don't have the answer for this. I'm more of a lawyer than like I don't know enough about uh, AI to be able to say, oh, this is the exact prescription that we need right now. But I do know some of the options that we've done in the past for some of these labor intensive, capital intensive uh,
mm,
ventures that then the rest of us need access to one way or another. And there's plenty of ways that they can make their money back without basically surveilling all of us as the way that they're going forward, doing all sorts of other things that I don't like, and I
mm.
don't think are healthy for a society that wants to be self-governing.
Great. Let's talk about the property from the legal way, which is I don't know a lot about. I'm all day, every day vibe coding a bunch of stuff, so I'm getting deep into the technicalities of all these layers of complexity from, but a completely different complexity. I like to pay attention to it. I like to study it, of the legal system that we have and like how it became and where it's going. And but about property, let's focus it on property. I mean, but there's a bunch of different types of law, though, right? Like, and can you talk more about what type of law you studied?
Well, I'm a constitutional lawyer, so
Oh, okay.
I'm a I'm a litigator that deals with the Constitution. But because of where EFF has gotten, I have actually a pretty deep knowledge of what is called intellectual property, which I think
Okay.
is a very bad metaphor. But things like
Ooh.
copyright, trademarks,
Why is it a bad?
patents,
Why is it a bad
because it's
metaphor?
not property.
It's abstract. It's like you can't hold it. It's not physical.
It's also not, it's a piece of property, there's only one, right? I live on a house in San Francisco. You cannot make a copy of that. But in the digital world, what they call intellectual property is
Oh.
all stuff that is mutable. It's not immutable. And so using something that is immutable and finite, like a piece of land, or as your model for how you think about things that are infinitely copyable, cheap and free, leads you to some really bad places. And it's one of the areas where EFF has traditionally done a lot of work. It's not the case that a song is like a piece of land.
Hmm.
And but yet if we use what the 19th century law developed around pieces of land to think about pieces of software, it's going to lead us to some really bad places for society. Like you can't make a copy, that's illegal and you could go to jail. Where we built these tools, they're called computers, that make copies easily, cheaply, freely, right? So it can't and so it's not a very good
Yeah.
metaphor. It's a bad metaphor for what people are doing. And so that's why I don't like it. I think that copyright is copyright, trademark's trademark, but calling it intellectual property takes people to a place in their brain that's wrong.
So how does that? Because from my studies of what happened over the past 20 years with the surveillance business models, and I think it's really important to talk about the business models because I think you're exactly hit it. It's the tie-in between a corporation and the government. How much of that intellectual property as metaphor has shifted the conversation in ways that it shouldn't have shifted. Like, what is the like? Did the surveillance business models? Those all rest on the fact that they can get metadata, right? That they can buy all the metadata from these exchange houses, and then do whatever they want. And then the key thing I think with the Anthropic thing was that they could actually connect that to a person's entire thought sphere with this LLM and like could actually like because they couldn't actually process the amount of data that would be necessary to get hyper targeted individual, which I think they now can. I don't, I'm not saying that this is the truth. I just this is what my research has led me to believe is that we're in a state like this right now is the moment at which surveillance goes from a general population level to an individual level, and we have to be very careful of these next steps because I just threw a lot at you again. Where are you interested
I
in
mean,
diving? Yeah.
I would say that I would say that intellectual property is not the core problem with
Mm.
the surveillance business
Okay.
model. I think the core problem of the surveillance business model is a couple of other things. The first one is that the information that is collected about us for one purpose, like to make sure our phones ring where we are, location data, is being freely used
Mm.
for secondary, tertiary, for
Mhm,
multiple
mhm,
other
mhm,
purposes, which are
mhm.
not in our interest
Mm.
and are against us. And I mean, there's a way you can think about intellectual property where they think of that metadata as theirs. But I think
Interesting.
that takes you to a bad place where you think, oh, well, then it's mine and I should be able to sell it to them. And I don't think that gets
Oh,
us where we
interesting.
need to go. I think that's actually a trap that a lot of people are falling into. Is again bringing ownership models into it. But what I think is important is this idea of a privacy principle, which
Mm.
is data that is collected about us for one purpose can't be used for other purposes. It just
Mm.
can't. And that will then put the onus back on that'll start to cut off what's feeding this thing at the knees, and make it they can't run all the inferences they can't do. I mean, they can still run some of them, but I think that what you're thinking about is the 360 degrees individual surveillance thing
Mm.
comes
Mm.
from their being able to track us in 360 degrees. And all of that is because in order to use tools for one purpose, we're giving data that then is being used for all these other purposes that we uh, don't have any control over and are dangerous, and are increasingly being marshaled against us on the commercial side as well as on the law enforcement side. Um,
Mm.
Again, I think that like Anthropic didn't draw the lines where I would draw the lines in terms of human rights, but it's not a surprise to me that they saw that the use of all of their AIs to do surveillance on Americans, domestic surveillance,
Yep.
was one of the red lines, is because they saw how powerful that could be. And I don't think it's just powerful individually. I actually think it's powerful for groups as well, and it supercharges what they were already able to do with some inferences that even without AI, but AI supercharges it and makes it a lot more powerful. And I think that that's why they drew the line where they did. And we stood with them because it shouldn't be the case that a corporate CEO stands between us and the surveillance state. But when one does, we're going to say yes.
Mm.
It would be better if our actual government that we elected
Yeah, it's so crazy.
put some rules in place that limit how these companies and the government can use all this data that we shed as a side effect of living our lives today.
Do you think Europe has the right model for that? Do you think that Europeans are thinking more about this, or what's going on?
I mean, I think that it was a good try, the GDPR. I'm not sure that it's working in the way that people had hoped, but it's better than doing nothing.
Mm.
I guess I don't want to throw too many rocks at them. I think it was an effort to try to think about how one might use consent as a
Mm.
thing, and I think that in some ways it's been successful, certainly. But I don't think it's gotten us where we wanted it to get. California has a law as well that is just getting
Hmm.
implemented. That's pretty strong, but it's taking a while, and I'm not sure how much it's doing either. It's partially why I think we should just ban this surveillance business model. Like all these
Mm.
half measures are not doing what I think people would like in terms of limiting the ability of our data to be marshaled against us.
Mm.
Um, and I think that, but I think it's, uh, the thing about the GDPR is, and the European study is that is really only about corporate use of data. It's not actually about government
Oh,
use. And I
interesting.
think that we have to take on both pieces. And because again, I'm fundamentally a constitutional lawyer, that is about the government versus you and what your rights are versus the government. And I think, right
Well,
now, the number one purchaser of information from data brokers is the US government. And Kash Patel, the FBI director, just said that they're going to continue to do it. So we can't leave that piece off the table. If we're going to do this, we have to include it.
that was very important. Thank you for sharing that. So, uh, let me walk you through what I've been thinking about my own building. So I've been building servers. I now know what a server is. I've got multiple servers. They're all hosted in the United States. And I'm like, okay, well, USA has this thing called a Cloud Act, which means that my business in the United States is regulated according to the Cloud Act. Doesn't matter where the servers are. So they can basically, the US government can reach into the rest of the world. And they've already been doing this extrajudicially, that's not the right word, but through the Five Eyes, the Nine Eyes, and the 12 Eyes network, they're basically already using surveillance from other countries in order to spy on American citizens through this sort of convoluted
Well,
world.
they're not supposed to.
They're not supposed to. Okay, and I don't know. This is the part of the secret government that is just, or the surveillance state. Some people call it the deep state. Some people, there's so many words for it. There's administrative state, but in general, it's a secret government that can basically do a lot of things without the U.S. population putting their word in. And so like the territory, the chessboard, the map of data is really interesting. And have you seen any country that has a government that, and from my research, basically Norway is the most sort of privacy centric government in the world right now, that will sort of like they ally with law enforcement when law enforcement needs things, which I think makes sense. But then they basically do a very high degree of privacy. And companies are now moving outside. Or Proton recently moved out of Switzerland, and they moved to Germany, which has its own issues with the sort of surveillance government as well. Do you, like, on a global level? What is your understanding of the map right now?
I don't have one.
Mm.
That's a full-time job for a lot of lawyers. There's a
Yeah.
whole
Oh,
department, there is not, at companies like Google to try to do uh, uh,
whoa.
governmental arbitrage and figure out who's best. I would say it really requires a much deeper level of thinking about what your threat model is, what you're doing, where you and what jurisdiction. I would say nobody's covering themselves in glory right now.
Yeah.
But there are better and worse places depending on who it is you're worried about.
Mm.
So there are people who are trying to build these distributed compute networks
Yeah.
that are outside of the U.S. jurisdiction because they are people who are doing U.S. government accountability or police accountability in the U.S.
Whoa.
They're better off not hosting their information here. If your worry is about the Chinese
Yeah.
government, you're going to make a different
Yeah.
set of decisions. If your worry is about the government of Zimbabwe, you're going to make a different. So, and if you're, so it really does depend on an individual threat model analysis and some pretty deep analysis of multi-jurisdictional governmental structures that anybody who tells you off the top of the head that they know, they do not.
Yeah. Yeah. Whoa.
That's not, it's just not something anybody could tell you without a lot more analysis.
The constitutional lawyer thing kind of just jumped up at me, basically because the U.S. has a constitution, but we now live in such a globalized world. Going back to what we were talking about in the 1980s and 1990s, just like, it used to be so expensive to just talk to somebody on the phone in the 1950s and the 1960s, and now we're not talking about talking on the phone. We're talking about things like what we're doing now, which is just like full on communication, real time synchronous communication, and so the U.S. interacts with a bunch of different other countries. How much has that been an issue or a benefit or whatever for EFF? That the fact that, like, as you guys have been going, the world has gotten more and more globalized. Have you mostly focused on the U.S. and like what's going on in the U.S.?
We have an international team. We have a
Okay.
couple of people who are working in Europe right now because we got to stay on top of it, right? I mean, our job is to try to protect users all over the world. So we
Cool.
try to, but honestly, it's global. It's a lot. Every country has their own set of rules, their own practices. I mean, you mentioned the Cloud Act. We were very opposed to the
Mm,
Cloud Act
mm,
because we really wanted. Uh, we didn't want the whole world the you know the U.S. Companies should be able to say no to foreign companies who are coming and looking for foreign governments who are coming to looking for data about there. We work with a lot of refugees. We work with a lot of dissidents, people who are seeking asylum or who have asylum here, and you don't want Google to have to respond to the government of Kazakhstan when it's going after a dissident and hand that information. So making sure the Cloud Act is a worrisome thing for us because it is limiting the ability of people to actually seek asylum and safe haven from
mm.
aggressive repressive governments by setting up a global standard or well the Cloud Act is only I think the US and the UK,
Oh,
um,
interesting.
but it's setting up a standard for cooperation with law enforcement that I think it could be very dangerous for people who actually fear their own legitimately fear their own government.
Which is my main challenge right now is just like is the U.S. going that route as well, and that's the main issue I see with the censorship is it doesn't matter whether it's the last party, this party is just like the road we're going down seems to be a very challenging road that has been a big issue for every nation state, not only nation state but monarchies as well. Just like the bureaucratic incentive to have full control over speech is a quite ancient one.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's done better or worse over time, right?
yep.
And
Mhm.
I think that the whole development of the idea of constitution, the idea of rights, the idea of domestic rights or international human rights is trying to create a bulwark against this
Yeah.
authoritarian tendency that you're right that we see. And that's honestly why a democracy came up, is the idea that the governed should have a voice, and who gets to govern us is one of the other bulwarks that we have. And we're seeing those being attacked in multiple directions. So I think that there is no. I mean, look, I think there's technologies, there's encryption, there's all sorts of things that can help you protect yourself, but I actually think there is no substitute at the end of the day for us reasserting control over our own
George.
government
Yeah.
and voting for the right people, and not allowing not standing for this. I do think that it's pretty clear that we actually need to get engaged more broadly than just developing technologies. That's a piece of it, but it's not going to alone protect us.
So, in this for the last 10 minutes or so, I want to go into that because you're now leaving the EFF, right? And can you talk more about what your plans are?
I don't know yet. I
Mhm.
feel like I've been at EFF for, I've been at EFF for 26 years. I've been doing this work for over 30. I
Hmm.
think there's something healthy about passing the torch to the next generation and letting other people lead. As long as people on the top don't leave, the next generation doesn't get their chance. So I think as a matter of kind of health of the movement, it's important for people, with the silver hair to sometimes step aside and let people, they don't have to be younger, but let different people lead. So I think there's just an organizational health reason. I'm a litigator, I'm a fighter, and being the executive director of a 125 person organization doesn't let me get as close to the fight as I'd like to be. You end up being the person who helps support the organization rather
Yeah.
than the person who's writing the briefs or putting the cases together. There's just not enough time in
Hmm.
the day. So I'm hoping to get back closer to the fight by stepping down and also let EFF have new leadership, and so I'm going to step down. I would love to stay and be a staff attorney at EFF, but I don't think
Oh,
that's fair
interesting.
to I don't
Yeah.
think that's
Yeah.
fair to the next person who comes along to actually need to lead it, to have me still hanging
Yeah.
around. So I'm going to look for something else to do that kind of gets me closer to the fight. I'm going to take a little break because
Yeah. It's been a long time. Uh,
time. But I think there's a lot that needs to be that we need to stand up for, and I'll probably reemerge and be doing some of this work as well, but just from a different place.
and so, and you don't have to speak personally here, but like, just can you, as somebody, an outsider who doesn't know, understand how the legal system works, what is the fight? Like, where is the fight? You said briefs and something else. Like, is it in a courtroom, or is it, it's what, where is the fight?
I mean, I think for me, it's in the courtroom. That's what I'm good at. That's what I
Oh,
like to
interesting.
do. I think it's a full court press, whatever tool. Again, I don't, I think that developing technologies of freedom and security is really an important role. And lots of people are doing it. It sounds like that's some of the stuff that you're doing. And that's really important. Like everybody has to look into their own heart,
Yeah.
decide what skills they have that they can bring to the fight, and try to help
Interesting.
bring about a better world. My skills are probably largely courtroom.
Hmm.
There may be other places as well, but that's what I'm going to be doing after
Hmm.
my EFF has named my successor. Her name is Nicole Ozer. She's a fabulous a friend of EFF who's been around for a long time, working with the ACLU of Northern California, but also doing lots of other things. And so she's going to be taking over in June. And I'm really excited for the next chapter for EFF. And then I'm going to look into my heart and decide where I want to be next to be part of trying to build a better world. I suspect, given who I am, it'll end up with in more on the litigation side, but I don't know yet.
Hmm. And so, last sort of questions. You wrote a book. How does the book play into the past, the future, the present?
Yeah, so the book is called Privacy's Defender, and it's three stories of big fights that I've done to try to stand up for privacy, and against digital surveillance. And I wrote it for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is because I do think that a lot of the history of the 1990s and the early
Hmm.
kind of internet is about guys and the companies that they built. And people think of the 90s and they think of Bill Gates, and they think of Steve Jobs, and like that was happening, but it's a pretty narrow view of what were pretty rich times. And so a bunch of hackers got together, they built, they came to me and they asked me to stand up for privacy online, and we did. And we went to the courtrooms together and we did all this work.
Wow.
And I just think it's an important part of the history that is getting lost. And, part of what you said about like, these early countercultural people were all magically thought everything was great. And like, that's not actually the world I lived in. So I felt
Yeah.
like rather than complain about it, I should write my history of those times. And then after 9/11, things really switched, and it became a lot harder to stand up for people's rights
Hmm.
of the national security concerns that informed the Patriot Act and some of the secret stuff that went on. Not Patriot Act was above board. There was a bunch of secret stuff, and the work that we did to try to fight that. So I felt like it was important to tell these stories, both because it's history that I think needs to be preserved, but also because right now we're in a time when we actually need to plug some of the holes in our rights that were created, especially
Hmm.
after 9/11. A lot of the problems that people are worried about right now, a lot of things that we're seeing the Trump administration do is to use national security as an excuse to clamp down on our rights. Well, I lived through how all those
Whoa.
holes got poked into our rights. And I think that it's important for people to know how we got here if we're going to
Yeah.
get out of them. So my goal is to try to recruit people into thinking that they can be part of making things better, and to tell these stories kind of in a personal way, to give, rather than like journalists write about this kind of stuff, academics write about this kind of stuff, but I actually lived it, and I thought letting people ride along on my shoulder about how we did these kinds of things might help be a way for them to think that maybe they could do it too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And how can they find more about EFF and more about you and everything like that?
EFF.org. We are member supported. If you think what we're doing is important, please join. We have cool merch, but also you have the ability to make sure that technology supports
Mm,
freedom and justice and innovation for all the people of the world. If you want to know about the book, it's EFF.org/privacy's defender, or anywhere you buy books, audiobook, everything. It's all available. If you want to take a look at that, that's another thing that you could do.
great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.